Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank Mark and his team, particularly the technical experts that I've had a great deal to do with in the last day getting me set up and allowing me to participate in this conference. And I'd like to congratulate him on the founding of the Security Governance Group and the fine work that he's doing. Um, I also want to congratulate my fellow panelists and thank them for their very detailed and informative presentations. I'm going to come at the topic from a little different perspective. My particular expertise is in the generic topic of security sector reform. For the last several years, I was the director of the Center for Security Sector Governance at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and in that capacity, I was asked in the last couple of years by agencies of the U.S. government to take a look at security sector challenges, security sector transformation challenges in North Africa, including Libya. Okay, so from the point of view of security sector reform as a concept and as a process, we have in Libya a dual challenge. One of reforming the existing Ministry of the Interior and the existing police force, but one of rebuilding almost from scratch the Ministry of Defense and the Army, which had been allowed to wither in places where it occurred. On the positive side, Libya as a country has unique financial and human capital resources, but it also lacks the experience with organized and formal government institutions, and that many of those government institutions in Gaddafi were perverted or twisted in ways that made them almost recognizable. And then, as we've heard, there has grown up a tradition of privatized governance services, even including security. Libya historically lacks institutional models and legal infrastructure. We heard there's not a common understanding of what would be the most appropriate bureaucratic organizations. And then, like many places in North Africa, Middle East, there's a challenge from Islamist extremists who bring a totally different set of models and sense of what is appropriate in terms of national transformation. At the same time, I believe that the international community also is at something of a loss in the sense that there are two things that the international community can do in dealing with a situation like Libya. One model is the preemptive model. In the 1990s, the preemptive model was the one that was most in fashion. We saw massive United Nations NATO operations in the Balkans. And in the last decade, we saw equally large US-led operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think that anyone believes that either of those two models are appropriate for Libya, nor does anyone believe that the international community would be able to mount those kind of operations today. And so there is a loss about how to proceed, and I think it might be fair to characterize the current international community approach to the entire Arab Spring collection of countries as meandering in action, not quite being sure of what to do. I think in many respects, the international community at large is looking for opportunities, points of access, or ways in which it can engage in a helpful manner. In conversations that I had with people that in Western embassies and in Tripoli, they described the conversations that they were having with counterparts as one in which they would ask the question, what is it you need? And the answer coming back was, what is it you have? Because we need everything and we can use whatever you can give us. And then the response to that was, well, we're Western-style bureaucrats. Words, but we come from a Western bureaucratic tradition where you have to explain and then we have to explain and then we go forward on that basis. We can't just provide what's currently on the shelf and hope for the best. Okay, so meanwhile, I think looking back over the last year, I'm struck by the fact that when I was in Libya last, which was the end of last summer, right after the elections, there was still this extremely high level of optimism and a real spirit of esprit, a sense that things were really possible, that the new government was going to take charge, and decisions that had been left pending were actually going to be made. And I'm struck, listening to the presenters that preceded me with a sense that this is not happened, and perhaps that enthusiasm is beginning to wane, and people are beginning to ask if these changes aren't possible. The kinds of questions that were raised by the other panelists are the kinds of questions that we were considering last year. And so there's been a sort of lost opportunity here in terms of moving ahead. The expectation clearly a year ago was that once a national and elected government was in place, the decisions would be taken. One of the key guiding principles of security sector reform is the importance of local buy-in and national leadership. Without local buy-in and without national leadership, security sector transformation simply can't take place. We've heard the other panelists say that there's a basic need for strategic assessments and strategic planning in approaching the security sector. These are fundamental concepts for security sector reform. I'll tell you a little story. I'll relate an anecdote. When I was in Libya, I met with officials in the Ministry of the Interior, and one of the people I talked to was a brigadier general who was in charge of foreign procurement. We talked about his situation, and at the end of the conversation, or toward the end of the conversation, I asked him if he could ask for one thing from the international community to help him in his work and to get him started. What would he ask for? And I was surprised by his answer. He said, what I need is someone who understands personnel databases. And I said, what do you mean? And his response was that he was faced with a situation in the ministry where in the beginning, or under the Gaddafi regime, the part of the ministry that had been tasked with doing training programs had not been actually allowed to do any training for the police, and instead had been tasked by the Gaddafi regime to take on the task of disassembling failed government enterprises and providing for the workforce that had worked in those institutions. And what they'd done simply was to put these people onto the rolls of the ministry so that they continued to receive salaries, although they didn't work. And so there were 50, 60, who knows, 1,000 people who were on the ministry's rolls who got a regular salary, but no one knew who they were exactly or what they were doing. Then there were another 15 to 30,000 people who were police officers, but the brigadier admitted that no one quite knew how many of these people were actually performing police functions, how many of them were actually coming to work on a daily basis. And then there was this other group that had just been added to his ministry, and that was the revolutionaries that were in SSC. And I said, okay, those are your guys, right? And he said, no. And then he said, yes. And then anyway, it wasn't clear. But the fact is that, starting with a situation where you're in a ministry with loaded roles, nobody's quite sure what people are doing and where they are, who they are. That would be, obviously, from the point of view of a security sector reform specialist, a place to start. But then the obvious questions arise. What is the role of the police force in Libya? How large should it be, and what should it be doing? And then how do you train that force? Where do you train it? How do you uniform it? There's an old Chinese saying that to know is difficult, but to do is easy. And in the case of Libya, to know what the circumstances are, and then begin to move forward is the biggest challenge. If Libya were able to move ahead on police reform, and that's my background, I was a previous head of the U.S. Department of Justice International Police Training Program. The appearance on the streets of Libya of well-trained, well-equipped, and highly motivated police would remove the evident need for alternative and privatized forms of security. It would be harder and harder for militia groups to justify their existence on the basis of the fact that they needed to be there. There have been incidents in Libya in the last year where private citizens of society groups have come forward and demand that the militias stand down, and motivated public in Libya, educated by public affairs campaigns or public information campaigns, would be a force to begin to make the transition process that my fellow panelists have said is required. Nothing takes place in security sector reform, police transformation, or military modernization without political agreement. And that is the starting point, and that is the sustaining force behind the effort. Clearly, there is a need for decision makers with publicly accepted legitimate authority. If Libya is unable to produce that, then it's doubtful that there's going to be much public process or much public achievement in the future. And so I think that's a primary point where we should start. I'd share what has been said by others on the panel, and that is that short-term or quick fix approaches, training police officers in a variety of different countries on a variety of different curriculums to do a variety of different things, and then bringing them back and trying to integrate them into a course. That kind of an approach can be counterproductive. It also can be dangerous. And so there's a need for national leadership, there's a need for strategic assessment, there's a need for strategic planning, and then there's a need for coordinated implementation along a path that has common understandings. This may seem somewhat the obvious, but if you tie together the things that my fellow panelists have said, that's where all of Mark's point. And so I think I will stop at this point, and I will open and wait for questions. Thank you very much, Mark, and others for the opportunity to hear today.